Sunday morning. It's the 30th of August 2020 and I have been reading two books aloud. The first one, The Only Planet of Choice, which was Wonderful Question and Answers, published in 1993, and then I started to read The Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth, which is actually published much earlier in 1977, and this is actually a story, a true story I believe, but I leave that to the listener. It was written by a man called Stuart Holroyd, Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth, and it describes our planet Earth from a very far perspective, in fact from off-planet. It's a group of beings, extraterrestrials, who have approached a group who coincidentally synchronistically met, and it's an English aristocrat, a doctor and a medium, Phyllis Schlemmer. And I started chapter 5 the other day, but I finished. These are very long chapters, and the sentences are long, and so I separate the chapters when it gets too long or too dark or whatever. So I have started chapter 5 called Encounters with the Opposition. It was riveting, and I will now continue. I'll stop a little bit further up to get you in. They're just having a session with Tom, who speaks for the Council of Nine. When the positive has no understanding of the negative, it is out of balance, Tom said. Without being aware of the negative and being aware that it must be balanced, then that is out of balance. And the answer to your question is yes. That is very important for our understanding, Andrija said. Tom continued. Because of the ignorance of the peoples of your planet, and because of their religious leaders, who have taught this ignorance, the negative forces which are not truly as you see them, manifest in that way in order to instill fear. But what is truly negative, what has created the upset, besides the desires and the greed, is the complete denial of the existence of God. Do you understand? Yes, Andrija said. So this is the greatest thing that has to be redressed or righted? Tom said, this is correct, and you must explain also to the people the necessity for earth people and for the souls and spirits that surround your earth to release themselves from greed and desire, because that is the trap. Your religious leaders do not understand this and do not teach the people. At the beginning of the communication that contained this discussion, which took place on the 8th of October 1974, Tom said that there was a meeting of the council in progress, and while she was out of her physical body, Phyllis would be taken before the council again to have some things explained to her, which she would report to the others when the communication was over. Towards the end of the session, Tom politely took leave of John and Andrija for a short time in order to go and meet with a being. They called Phyllis their being. And when he returned, he said that many things had been explained to her, and they should have a conversation immediately on her return, for she would remember part of what she had experienced and learned, and other parts of it would be recalled in the conversation. This was one of the most interesting of all Phyllis's reports of her out-of-the-body experiences, both in herself and because of the way some of its themes parallel and complement the themes of the communication that was taking place at the same time. This simultaneity of two corresponding but distinctly different and individually coherent experiences argues strongly, it seems to me, in favor of the view, which I'm sure some readers will still doubt, that Tom exists independently of Phyllis's unconscious. Oh, I went on a trip, was the first thing Phyllis said when she came out of trance. I think I've been before the Nine. First of all, they showed me how I got there, how I go there, and how they communicate. They come in on different beams. Like when I'm being removed from my body, they use a beam. They bounce it off like satellites, and it depends on something in the atmosphere, the way they beam in. Anyhow, So I got called up and they said I was creating problems. I wish I could remember it all. They appeared in human form and I said, you're not like that at all. Why do you look like that? And then they were energy. They said that I am causing problems, that I am frustrating you and John, that you have faith and I haven't. I argued that point because I do have faith. I have faith in God. They said what I was doing was creating problems by wanting intricate revelations. And I don't understand what they mean by that, but I got the essence of what they were saying. Then I asked them something. I said, I'm quite upset about all the stuff you're telling John and Andrija, because I don't know if you're going to make all these things happen. They said I shouldn't doubt them. So I asked them to show me how things were going to happen, you know, with the radios and television and all of that. And it's Ultima that's going to do it. Ultima hooking up with Hoover. Did they tell you how? Andrija asked. Yes, with these kind of beams. The same kind of beams they use with me. It's difficult to explain. I'm not scientific. But there's like a big spiral and they are in the center, and out of this center in all directions come literally thousands of very thin wires, and they take one of these beams or one of these wires and this is how they come in. And they can move them around and bounce them off things. It was hardly a description to satisfy Andrija's longing for new and verifiable technology or know-how, but he had to be content with it because Phyllis suddenly remembered something else. Oh yes, do you know who they had on their carpet? They had a pope up there. A pope? John laughed. They had him on the carpet. Yes, they were bawling the pope out. They said he was creating more problems. The memories were crowding each other now. Phyllis changed the subject again. Oh yes, and then they explained evil and good. They showed me very ugly things. And they said, these, in your world, are very frightening to you. They weren't frightening to me there. They were just animals and insects and things that we are not accustomed to. They said, these, to some people, are beautiful, and to other people, they're ugly. And it depends on where you are at in your relationship to it. And they said that they weren't ugly or beautiful, they just were. Then they showed me other civilizations. I didn't like them. They weren't good, though that's not the right word now. We're not supposed to use that word. John was intrigued by the image of the Pope on the carpet and asked Phyllis if she could recall anything more about that. Well, John, I think he'd been there for a hell of a long time, Phyllis said. You mean it may not have been the present Pope Paul? What does he look like? Andrija described him as thin, with a beaky nose, and Phyllis said with a cry of recognition, that's him! Were they trying to straighten him out? John asked. Yes. And? Was he going along with it? No, Phyllis said. He felt that he was absolutely right in his rationale. Most of the time, she said, she had been in the presence of just 8 members of the council, and then Tom had come along. Asked by Andrija to describe what they had looked like, she said that at first they looked like venerable old men. But when she said, none of you are really like this, I want to see what you're really like, they turned into balls of light that were like pure energy, but with a soul. Perhaps that's what a soul looks like, Andrija said. Perhaps that's what they are. All souls and no body. Right, Phyllis said. Anyway, they were very nice to me. They explained to me my responsibility, and they were very, very loving, and they said, I've got to stop denying them. I said, I wasn't denying them. And then they showed me, now this was interesting. They took like the negative and the positive forces of energy, and they showed, now if you're so positive and you spin, they showed me this energy spinning, and it kept spinning so fast it gets light and it disappears. And the negative also spins, but with its spinning it picks up other stuff and it gets dark. It's an energy that gets dark and then it falls. And they showed me that neither of those was good, because the way they were going, that soul was out of line. Or balance, Andrija suggested. Out of balance, right, Phyllis said. Andrija said, that's interesting. And he tried to make scientific sense of Phyllis's imagery in terms of spinning leading to increased velocity and eventually to disappearance into another dimension. After toying with this idea for a while, he asked her, did they give you any special instructions when they sent you back? Mainly, they wanted me to tell you that what they say will happen, Phyllis said. You mean there's no bullshit, Andrija said. Right, no bullshit, Phyllis said. Some readers may be of a contrary opinion, but from any point of view, the correspondence between this post-session report of Phyllis's and the information content on the communication itself must stand out as a phenomenon that challenges explanation. Tom's explanation on how an excess of the positive is as undesirable as an excess of the negative, and of the need to keep the two in balance, is paralleled in Phyllis's imagery of the spinning energies. And this point, that really there is no good and there is no bad, was vividly brought home to Phyllis when she was shown things to her were very ugly and told that to others they were beautiful. Again, Tom deplored the ignorance and ineptitude of the world's religious leaders, and Phyllis sees the Pope on the carpet. This phenomenon of Phyllis getting visual imagery corresponding to information that Tom expresses conceptually often occurs, and as human brains tend to have a bias towards conceptualization or visualization, it seems highly unlikely that Phyllis herself, at an unconscious level, should be generating both the concepts and the images. According to Tom, she is generating neither, but is channeling the concepts and being shown the imagery. In other words, both concepts and images are emanating from an external source, indeed from an extraterrestrial source. That may be difficult to believe, but it is equally difficult to find plausible psychological explanation of the phenomenon, even in the light of all that is known about the psychology of the dissociation of personality, for it is a case of two mental functions of a type that are totally different and usually mutually exclusive, going on at the same time. Though some of Phyllis's out-of-the-body experience reports tend to sound like science fiction scenarios, it seems to me that when, as in this case, they include imagery that parallels and complements the conceptual content of the communication, they must confound psychological explanation and constitute prima facie evidence that the communication as a whole emanates from an external source, which, depending on your point of view and the height of your credulity threshold, might be either a stunning revelation or a pretty obvious point no longer needing evidence. Of course, even if the existence of the external source may be considered, thus proved, this evidence says nothing for its reliability. But in this perplexing area, you can't ask too much of any one piece of evidence. Detective work has to be painstaking, patient, and piecemeal. In addition to holding daily communications while they were together at Ossinin during the first 3 weeks of October, John, Andrija, and Phyllis each had several sessions or treatments on Andrija's electronic equipment mentioned previously. The basis of this was an invention that Andrija had made years before for the treatment of nerve deafness. John, by chance, had just this condition caused by the noise of racing car engines and the device's unexpected side effect, the improvement of memory, might be of use for Phyllis, so Andrija had again asked about this in a communication. Tom gave him to believe that it was not a matter of chance that he had invented it, and that with some modifications and with Ultima, she's also extraterrestrial, with Ultima funneling energy at the same time it was in use, great things could be expected of it in a different area. Under these circumstances, it might not improve John's deafness, but it would cure Phyllis' memory problem, and it would also enhance awareness in all of them, serve as a means whereby they might each individually receive communications from the management, so that they would be able to validate the information received by cross-checking and facilitate the process of imprinting magnetic tape with information directly. Tom gave instruction as to how recording equipment could be incorporated in the system and said that between 23 and 28 consecutive daily treatments for each of them should complete the process and make direct communication and imprinting possible. As it turned out, none of them was able to complete the prescribed number of treatments without a break, so they didn't find out whether all the marvels that Tom anticipated from the use of the device would occur if his instructions were followed. There is a lot in the communications of this period about electrical energy and devices. On the 6th of October 1974, they held a communication in the evening in the normal way, but when they played back the tape was blank. They were sure they had not made a mistake in the recording procedure, so at the beginning of the next day's session, Andrija asked for an explanation. Tom had one. The communication we gave you was of vital importance because of some of the knowledge that was released. At the end of the communication, those that oppose were attempting to transpose on your tape, and the transposition would have led you to believe that it was coming from us, when it was not. So in order to prevent confusion and misunderstanding on playback, the tape had been erased. The opposition, the others, would have less chance of getting up to such mischief, Tom indicated, if the communication sessions could be held under conditions of electromagnetic shielding. The day after he made this suggestion, Andrija received a call from a company that was going bankrupt and wished to dispose of cheaply and quickly an unusual piece of equipment, namely a Faraday cage. He made arrangements to go and see the equipment in New York, and in the course of the next session with Tom mentioned that, fortunately, he would be able to get a Faraday cage for them to work in the near future. Things are not fortunate, Tom said. It is synchronistic happenings of this kind, and many such have occurred in the course of the work, that have convinced the group that they are not just spinning the entire web out of their own heads. The conversation that followed is worth reporting, for it gets back one of the recurrent themes of this period and one of the basic and more difficult themes of the communications as a whole. Andrija chuckled at the thought that the opportune offer of the Faraday cage was not just coincidence. There was just a suggestion of admonition in Tom's "things are not fortunate," as if to say Andrija should have known this. Well, you have to remember that we're stuck in bodies on the physical plane, Andrija said, so we haven't got the lofty perspective that you have. Tom said, "You have because you are one of us, or you would not be where you are." "Yes, I understand that we are one of you," Andrija conceded, "but I think that we are like one of you who has chosen to come onto Earth and take on the body of an ant, with all its limitations, and therefore what one thinks, feels and does has all the limitations of the ant. Is that not true?" This is true, and all of us decided that if such a situation arose again, if a planet should fall out of caliber again, rather than permitting a few of our people to return to help, that planet, all of us would return in order to understand. But that is not possible now, for there is no longer enough time. Andrija asked, "So then we came with a total memory wipeout and just acted and lived like people on Earth, right?" "The reason for the memory wipeout is because of the atmosphere in which you live." "Well, I can understand if we had the slightest inkling of who we were, we wouldn't have tolerated the situation," Andrija said. But Tom did not agree. "This is not necessarily so. Because you are who you are, you can tolerate anything. You've had glimpses in your consciousness of who you are." Andrija said, "Yes, but those seem like wild imaginings, as you can surely conceive. Have you yourself ever been on this planet, Tom?" "Yes, but you must remember that in my time there was not the confusion that there is now, and there was not the density that there is now. And I do not mean gravitational density, but density of pollution and radiation. which also affects the body and the mind. Andrija said, yes, that's a very serious problem. Is there anything that can be done in the next few years? Tom said, the reason for us will be one. Then after a pause, they say I'm making in riddles. Yes, that was a bit of a riddle, Andrija agreed. Tom explained, one of the reasons for the arrival of the civilizations that will help this planet is because of this problem. Tom was getting clearer this time. In a number of communications over this period, Tom set out to make good their memory wipeout by giving them details about their earliest associations with the planet Earth. The purpose was ostensibly to make them more clearly understand their roles in the present mission, and Tom repeatedly insists that the information is not given in order to flatter their egos. He said, you were among the first arrivals of us, and that was over 34,000 years ago, Andrija was told. You were one of the founders of the first civilization. Your story of Adam and Eve was from this time. And where would that have been on Earth, he asked. In Axel. Andrija remembered the name. It was still on modern maps. They had come across it when they had checked the coordinates that Tom had given in his first communication at Count Pino Turola's house in March. Ah, that's the place in the Tarim Basin, he said. That is right. And I gather that civilization didn't succeed. It was not your fault. It was too soon. It was a high civilization, but not adapted. Andrija asked, can you tell us what elements of civilization we tried to give at that time? What was it we were concerned with? Was it agriculture, medicine, astronomy, or what? It was a language. It was to raise the beings from the level of near animal. It was a way to communicate. A sophisticated idea this, that language is not so much the product as the basis of a civilization, the prerequisite of any evolutionary leap, as it is stated in St. John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word. Andrija asked if the landing had survived, and Tom said it had, but not down to the present age. When the first civilization had failed, not all had been lost, for groups of people from it had moved into 3 other parts of the world where civilizations had in due course developed, but these in turn were equally eclipsed. Andrija further learned that he had spent 1600 years on Earth at that time, and that during this period he helped give the civilization of Aksu not only language, but also knowledge of building, agriculture and healing. John had been incarnated as his son, and had kept up the good work after his departure for a further 2000 and some years. Then, 600 years after John's first earthly stint, some natural disaster had brought the civilization of Aksu to an end. On a later mission to Earth, John and Andrija had been joined by Phyllis, who had been involved with the civilization of Ur, or Sumer. They had also all 3 worked together in Egypt. Tom said, in the time of 5,000 to 6,000 years. If we take this to mean between 5 and 6,000 years ago, he's talking about the 4th millennium BC, when, according to the Egyptologist J. Viau, the earliest representations of the Egyptian deities appeared. Andrija and John were fascinated by this information and wanted Tom to tell them more, but he declined to do so at the present time because he said there were problems. Opposition forces were building up, and if the information about their heritage were known, the opposition would become angrier and more dangerous. He too would be glad when the 22nd of the month came, for after that the opposition's power would be much diminished, and they would not be capable of mounting a sustained attack. So he would resume the record of their earlier lives at a later date. I wonder how many readers the last 2 pages have lost us. Even thinking of Andrija, John and Phyllis not as personalities in a specific space and time, but as T-fields, does not help put down the suspicion that all this previous life stuff is one of monumental ego trip, though it is difficult to know whose ego trip it is, since they are all credited with important historical roles. I envisage 2 types of readers who might have stayed with this narrative so far: those who are interested in the message and those who are intrigued by the mystery. It is primarily to the latter that the following remarks are addressed. Tom divulged more information about previous lives in the course of the following months. If we asked what kind of information it is and where it comes from, and discount for the present the possibility that it is literally true and comes from an extraterrestrial intelligence, its consistency has to be taken into account in any answer we propose. The way that the information comes out also has to be taken into account. It is not given en bloc at any one time, but it is elicited in bits over a long period of time, sometimes by Andrija or John asking questions, and sometimes by Tom volunteering information, when the discussion takes an appropriate turn. If somebody were making up the entire background as they went along, the problem of maintaining consistency with the increasing complexity would become more and more formidable, and we would surely expect to find some anomalies cropping up in the later stages. If, on the other hand, it is not a case of the picture being gradually built up, then presumably the information exists in toto somewhere at all times, and bits of it become available from time to time. But then the question is, where does it exist? In the conscious or unconscious mind of a particular individual? In a disembodied mind? Or T-field? Whose mind? What T-field? The reader, intrigued by mysteries, will be greatly exercised by these questions as the full story unfolds. Though Tom was unable to say more about their previous lives at this time on the 12th of October 74, he had a great deal to say about their present lives, emphasizing that it was important for the work that the trio, both individually and as a group, should be well integrated and balanced. He said, "There are aspects of your personality that perhaps each of you do not recognize within yourself. We could tell you those aspects, but would you believe at this time?" Andrija said that he was sure they were all honest enough to acknowledge their weaknesses, and it would help if Tom would pinpoint the important ones. John agreed, saying it would be very valuable to have specific problem areas that they should work on pointed out to them. Tom said he would have to consult, and after a brief absence returned to report. "They tell me that it is important you should understand that we are not criticizing." "Oh yes," Andrija said, "we understand that you are just trying to make sure the project doesn't fail. But there was more to it than that. Remember, besides the project, the world that will exist after the landing. Do you understand that every aspect of your personality must be balanced for the work after?" To help them effect the balance, Tom now delivered a little speech addressed to each of them, in turn, addressing different points that the ones he had brought up in a similar session the previous month. As before, John was the first to be put under scrutiny. "Sir John, you can learn not to run from the world? Can you learn to be involved and not hurt? Can your frustrations be tempered? Can your frustrations be channeled and the energy used? Can your guilt be removed?" John said he didn't understand the first statement about his running from the world, and Tom explained. "Remember that in the future it will be important for you to deal with the world. It is difficult for you to deal with the world. Can you remove your guilt? Can you love yourself? Can you not voice your needs? Remember, you are the balances. You are the balance, but also remember that you need those to balance you. To Andrija, Tom said, "It has been your need to share your work and to share your love that has created problems in your marriages. Is it possible in your life to have a separate life and not involve the work? It is easier the other way, but let us explain to you your own insecurities. You do not face your insecurities. You think that as a fellow human of all the fellow humans of the human race, there is an element missing in you. May we say that as a human, which you are in your physical body, you have no need to have insecurities. You are complete. But in the vibration of your human life, you have a need to prove yourself and a need to involve those in your personal life in your work, because your insecurity tells you that only through your work will they be with you, and that is not true." Andrija admitted that this was a pertinent comment, and Tom went on to speak about Phyllis. She had over the past weeks largely overcome her problem of doubt and disbelief, but there was still the problem of ego. In this being's vibration, because of past history in this life, there is the necessity to be in front, the necessity to be in motion, the necessity to be completely independent, and that is ego. Can this being now be passive? Can she remove herself from the need to be in the center with people and to have people? Can she remove herself completely and be placed in an area of no contact? Andrija asked for clarification of the last phrase, and Tom said, "She is now in an area of no contact. If you understand this being's human life, you will understand of what we speak." Andrija said he assumed what was meant was no contact with friends, relatives and loved ones, and Tom had to correct him. "We mean no contact with many people and with the public," which clarified the apparent ambiguity of maintaining that she needed to be independent and at the same time needed to have people, for if the term people was understood to mean the public, the two needs were not inconsistent. From an evidential point of view, passages like this, of which there are several in the communications, are particularly interesting, for they do suggest that some intelligence, independent of the trio under scrutiny, is commenting from an objective viewpoint. Whatever the trio may have been in previous existences of elsewhere in the universe, they are now human beings with human limitations, and Tom has a superior insight and knowledge, and so can function as a kind of guru figure to them. He frequently does and is never at a loss for an answer, even when he is called on to produce one spontaneously to the most abstruse questions. "What is enlightenment?" was one that John brought up during one of the few sessions I have personally attended. Following the above-quoted psychoanalytic session, there occurred in the same communication a discussion very reminiscent of the guru-disciple situation, which is worth quoting because of the general interest of the questions raised. Andrija said, "We don't quite understand the way you use the terms soul and spirit. I wonder if you could clarify what the distinction is." Tom said, "There are actually three: mind, soul, and spirit. And when they blend completely, then you are pure energy, which is pure soul." Andrija asked, "And what is spirit as distinguished from the above two?" Spirit is the soul in the physical world, or the soul that manifests in the atmosphere of your physical world. It is a vehicle. Does it have any relation to the astral body? Yes, it is the astral body. And what about mind? Is it connected with the brain, with the spirit, or with the soul? The mind is connected with the soul. And the etheric body? And the soul cover. Is the soul cover. And the etheric body? The etheric body is the soul cover. Andrija recapitulated. So there are distinct functions of the human personality. The mind related to the soul, the spirit related to the body, and the soul, of course, independent if it is not in the body, but it is connected with the body, then it is connected with the etheric. This is right, Tom confirmed. Well, that's very important because world literature is in total confusion about these things, Andrija said. Tom says, while they were onto definitions, John asked about humour. Most of our humour, he said, is based on our physical existence, so I wonder if you understand our humour and if you have humour in your world. We have cosmic humour. God could not have survived without being able to laugh at himself. What happens in the universe when God laughs? Andrija asked. Does everything shake? Everything shines. As the climactic of 22nd October drew close, it seemed indeed that the opposition forces were redoubling their efforts. John, Andrija and Phyllis all suffered from insomnia, and Andrija and Phyllis particularly felt that their energies were low. Phyllis, out of trance, saw ugly or hostile presences around them, and though John and Andrija did not possess the dubious boon of psychic sight, they were both aware of an eerie atmosphere around the house. At the end of one session, Tom said, "There's an energy being sent. You're protected, and you will be protected, but the energy being sent is pacing outside of your home, and it is a wolf-like nature. It is a creation that may be given life if they attempt that." John listened intently in the ensuing silence and could swear that he heard something moving outside the house. None of them slept that night. Tom told them on another occasion, "There's being mobilized in the area around you the nature of a brute force, and an attempt is being made to use the lower forms. We ask you not to become alarmed or frightened, because we will be with you, but we may not be able to prevent the problem totally." And indeed they were not able to. Phyllis continued to suffer attacks of varying degrees of ferocity on her way into and out of trance, and on several occasions she couldn't get down to the necessary level because of the opposition. Once she counted down as far as 30 and then quickly brought herself out. She said she had seen a horrible thing and had known that if she didn't get out it would take her. It was a primitive being, a reptilian form, and it was lying dormant somewhere and had an eye that blinked now and then. "That thing couldn't have taken me," Phyllis said in disbelief, but it did have this strong sense of danger. When eventually she tried again, and successfully this time, Tom explained that the reptilian creature was a manifestation of the opposition. "But couldn't she just ignore it, go past it?" Andrija said. "It doesn't have any other power, does it?" "There's power in all things," Tom said, and in the intuition, if it is followed, there is protection. He went on to explain interestingly, "What is happening in going into communication with us is the reviving and seeing of all life, and of the beginning of all life. As we go to communicate, we go to what we were and through what we were. In order to communicate with us, this being must go to the beginning and through. She goes through all levels of existence and civilizations and times, and it is not always the experiences of the planet Earth. It is sometimes the experience of the universe. As she went through the levels," he explained on another occasion, "she had protection up to a point, but beyond that point there was an area to be crossed, which was crowded with beings and forms, an area similar to a no-man's land, and that should be a truce area, but those that oppose do not honor the truce. Several communications during this period ended abruptly with Tom saying that they were experiencing difficulty, that the opposition forces were building, or simply that they had to leave. Sometimes the departure was so hurried that there wasn't time for the customary valediction. We go in love and peace. And on these occasions, Phyllis came out of trance very distressed and sometimes crying, discussing this after such session. Andrija said, "It's very funny. It is as if Tom sees them coming and says, 'Oops, sorry, I've got to get out of here,' and then bails out." "Yes, how come he doesn't take them on?" Phyllis said. "That's what I was wondering," Andrija said. "Why doesn't he stay around and do battle with the dragon instead of leaving the fair lady stuck and having to fend for herself?" "Why don't you ask him?" Phyllis suggested. So at the beginning of their next communication, Andrija said, "We're very happy that our channel Phyllis was able to run this gauntlet, but we're getting very concerned about these endless attacks. I say this with all due respect, but are you indeed powerless to prevent them?" Tom said, "We have explained to you many times that until the 22nd of your October 1974, attempts will be made to prevent you from doing what is necessary." Tom spoke patiently. "The only way you would be stopped at this time would be if those opposing could frighten this being. But they are operating a useless war, and they realize that this being is one that will not give in." Which amounted to saying that Phyllis could look after herself. That reminded Andrija of an odd thing that had occurred that afternoon. Immediately after the previous communication, he and Phyllis had been in the kitchen, and he had complimented her on her bravery in running the gauntlet, and happened to add that neither Lyle nor Bobby would have had what it would take to do that. 10 minutes later, Phyllis' daughter had called from Florida and said that some poltergeist-type phenomena had just occurred in the house, for instance. Lyle's book, Supernature, had jumped out of the bookcase and into the middle of the room. "Can you explain these strange circumstances?" Andrija asked Tom, and he received the reply, "Yes. It was the anger and frustration of those that are opposing the cabal. Even during these fraught last days, there were periods of calm where the opposition was quiescent, which gave Tom an opportunity to expatiate freely and at a depth on a theme. At the beginning of a communication held on the 18th of October, Tom said, 'All is in harmony and balance,' and proposed, if they were all agreeable, to speak to them on the subject of knowledge. We would welcome such a discourse, Andrija said, and Tom spoke at some length about knowledge and responsibility, stressing that as the former increased, so did the latter. All the knowledge that we impart to you brings additional responsibility to you, he said, and explained that the council were concerned about this. They thought that because of the limitations of the physical world in which they lived, it might be difficult for John, Andrija, and Phyllis to maintain their balance as they gained in knowledge, and they wanted all three of them to consider, before they asked for further knowledge, whether it was needed for them to function, because, Tom concluded, additional knowledge that is not needed for you to function in the limited space of your world brings in additional responsibility. Andrija said, yes, we understand that, and he went on to make a distinction that John did not agree with, though he withheld his protest until after the session in order not to disrupt it. I think there are two aspects of what you speak about. There's the knowledge that is for our own personal growth, which we do not need necessarily to function. There is a part of us that would like to know as much as you may know, as part of our spiritual development. As for the knowledge that is just functional, we agree that we only need to know as much as necessary to carry out our task. Tom said, "May we ask a question of you?" "Yes." "Do you in your hearts, all three of you, believe that by partaking of knowledge you consider necessary for your spiritual development, your soul will grow?" Andrija said, "I personally believe that." John said, "I believe that knowledge is useful if it helps us understand the great responsibility that we have here. Some of this historical knowledge you have given us is helpful in this way, but I do understand that there is only a limited value for our functioning in that. On the other hand, both Andrija and I are very inquisitive and always like to acquire knowledge." Tom said, "If you so desire, it will be transferred to you, but remember what we have said." "Yes, I think we are capable of handling that," John said. "Can you handle it in humility? Do you walk in humility? Do you walk without desire? Do you walk without vanity?" We ask you to review these questions. Listen very carefully to what we say. You are now existing in a jungle in comparison with your true vibration. You are in a physical body, and we know that it is difficult, but you must remember that you must not permit your physical body to rule you. You must walk with the gods, and when we say this, we do not mean that you may not have your human comforts and needs, but we ask that what you do with discretion. You do with knowledge, and that you never, as individuals or as a triangle, give reason for any of those in your physical world to throw stones at you. Andrija said, "Yes, that's very clear. Talking about the gods, there's one question I'd very much like to ask. On earth there are many ideals of God, the Buddhist, the Christian, the Mosaic, the Hindu, and so on. Could you indicate which of these ideals most closely match the ideal of the nine?" "The ideals of the man called Christ, because he was the last of those of us," Tom answered. "And of those description of Christ given in the Bible, which is the most accurate?" Tom said, "There are many misinterpretations in your Bible. It is true that the man you call Christ lived a normal human existence, but he was a man of discretion, and he walked with discretion among the people." "Was he one of the nine?" "No, but he emulated their thoughts and their understanding. There are many things that are not told about him. For what he did in private, and did not allow the world to see him in his human frailties." Andrija said, "That is a big problem for us." Tom, "Remember who you are, and remember it is important to master the areas of your life. If you can be discredited for no matter what reason, then the jackals that are against you will find that reason." Andrija said, "It's very difficult for us to understand how so much could be at stake because of us. You've made it quite plain that if we remembered who we are, these things would become clear, and we have tried to do that, but it is difficult." Tom said, "We have told you who you are, and we understand that it is difficult for you to know who you are in your remembrance. But the most important thing for you now is to have faith in who you are." "We do have faith," Andrija said. "Our difficulty is articulating it, understanding it, and rationalizing it." Tom said, "We wish to tell you that we realize that we have asked much of you and have promised you nothing. And you have proceeded with faith, because within you, within all three of you, you have the wisdom and the knowledge and the strength. Walk with humility, walk with love, and walk with the peace that is in you, for when you do this, you generate peace around you. We leave you now, we go with peace and love." Phyllis came out of trance feeling good and without mishap, and the moving exaltation and assurances of this communication helped them all get through the trials and tension of the final days. Another thing that helped was the diversion afforded by the delivery, erection, and first use of the Faraday cage. It was delivered on the 18th, and they spent most of the next 2 days getting it set up and equipped. It was set up in the library, where it took up most of the floor space and left only a narrow book-lined passage around it. A heavy metal rectangular box of dimensions 8 by 8 by 12 feet. It had a heavy door that shut tightly and quietly, and Andrija equipped the interior with 3 chairs, a desk, and his recording apparatus. "Ooh, we have some friends in here," Phyllis said when they went into the cage to work for the first time, and she described some lights and colors and shapes that she could see, and some which she knew signified the presence of the space people. She was enthusiastic to work under the new conditions. "Well, now we can control the heat, the light, and the electrical environment that we work in," Andrija said to Tom at the beginning of this first session in the cage. "Are there any further improvements we can make?" Tom answered with instructions to line the interior of the cage with 3 layers of copper foil. They should also all obtain copper bracelets to wear during communications in the future. The bracelets should be molded so that they were as closely in contact with the skin as possible and be worn just above the pulse on both wrists. Also, when they had obtained the bracelets, they were to leave them in the cage for 3 days so that they could be worked on. For copper, after being submitted to certain processing, was a great aid to communication. If all these conditions were fulfilled, Tom said, they would be able to work at a higher rate of vibration. Although the opposition would not be entirely excluded from the cage, the cruder elemental forms would be, and its manifestations would tend to be subtler and cleverer. The opposition was not going to be totally inactive after the 22nd, but its attack would be less consistent and sustained, and the time of cosmic crisis would be over. There was going to be, however, a situation of worsening crisis on Earth, which may require their attention and intervention. Between the 8th November and 12th December 1974, there would be increased potential of a war breaking out in the Middle East, Tom said, and it might be necessary for them to go to that area. "When you have completed this period, there are very few things that cannot be accomplished," Tom had told them on the 16th October 74, and 2 days later he said that because of the energy they had generated, the danger of war had temporarily receded. The data had been that the United States and Britain would foment trouble in the Middle East in order to compromise Israel and to protect their oil interests. The US President had met with the Security Council that day, and there had been a swing away from a warlike posture, but their deliberations would not be completed until the following Monday, and each day until then the trio in a sinning would sit in meditation and send guidance and energy to the decision makers in Washington. President Ford, Tom said, could create problems. Ford, he correctly prophesied, would be the target for an assassination attempt within 2 years, made not by opposing forces but by people in your country who will think he is a fool. So before their period of trial was over, the trio received information that this period of intense subjectivity and introversion would be followed by one of the extroversions of their playing a significant role in the international political situation. Given the dates of the 8th November to 12th December 1974 at the time of political crisis, they must have been relieved that they were going to be able to have a couple of weeks off to relax and attend to their private affairs between rescuing the universe and rescuing the world from their respective crises. Tom said, "It is a joyous time for the universe because of you." He told them at the beginning of the session they held on the 23rd of October. "We do not flatter you, we tell you the truth. We are overjoyed because this is a great day and a time of joy in the universe. To celebrate the occasion, he divulged some more of the information about past lives that had previously been withheld, lest the opposition should overhear it. Tom said, "We understand that in your physical world it is difficult for you to relate to other than what you are," he said. "But it was important that they should learn to do so, and today and in some future meetings they would be given information that they would have to subsequently review in their minds, work on, and try to understand in relation to their present lives and work. As this information about the previous incarnations of the three is not of particular interest to anybody else, and it does rather overtax one's credulity, I will not report it in full here, but I will just give you an interesting example. John was told that one of his incarnations was as Peter. Not the Peter that was with Jesus, Tom said, but the Peter that was alone. That was a mystery to both John and Andrija, so John asked which period this Peter had lived in. Tom consulted and returned with the information that the date was about AD 1090. John asked which country he had worked in. "Near Jerusalem," Tom said, but then he said he would check, and after a pause corrected his statement. "They tell me that a trip was made to Jerusalem." The further information drew no light on the identity of Peter, but Tom said, "If you look, you will find," and left them that subject at that. They did look after the session, and under listings of Peter in an encyclopedia, they found one known as Peter the Hermit, the Peter that was alone, Tom had said, who had rallied the peasants of France with his emotional revivalist preaching to participate in the first ill-fated crusade during the 1090s, and had entered Jerusalem with the survivors in 1098. At the conclusion of this 23rd October communication, Tom asked, "Now that this period is over, can you give us any general information about our future plans?" "Yes," Tom replied. "The most important thing we must do is work towards the preservation of planet Earth. As we have told you before, if something is not done to reverse the devastation that has been perpetrated on the planet Earth, within 200 of your years, there will be an ice age. The important thing at this time is to prepare for the landing, which will bring the technology to help and save the planet." The plan to alert mankind by interfering with television communications was still in effect, and a unit was working on it. There was also now another extraterrestrial civilization working with them, named Ashand. Its field was creativity, and it would work through many people. Matthew Manning, the young English psychic, who had recently been astonishing scientists as much as Geller had done the year before, was from Ashand. And Tom said one of his talents was that he could draw and paint us. Yuri himself was still struggling with his personality, but there was a possibility he might come back to work and be involved in healing. One of the things John and Andrija could do was to pursue a plan they had been discussing for some time, to convene a conference of all the scientists who had worked with Yuri, for their collective testimony would convince themselves and others that what Yuri Geller did, was genuine, and make them ask how these things could occur. Another thing they could do was plan to make a film that would make ordinary people aware of what was going on in the universe and make them ask questions. But all these projects might have to be put aside, Tom intimated, if the situation in the Middle East deteriorated. The three were now going their separate ways for a short time, but he stressed they must be prepared to be recalled at short notice and to travel east. That was the end of chapter 5, entitled Encounters with the Opposition. Chapter 6 is called Ambassadors Extraordinaires, and I shall read it soon. I hope you have a lovely Sunday. I thoroughly enjoy reading this, and my dog was all quiet, no barking, and the sun's shining.